The morning sun glinted off the crystal blue waters of David Mitchell's backyard pool, casting dancing reflections across the patio that had once been his pride and joy. His morning ritual of coffee on the deck while admiring the pristine water was something he looked forward to every day since moving to Oakwood Estates 6 months ago. This particular Tuesday in June, however, would mark the beginning of a neighborhood war he never saw coming. What the actual hell? David sputtered, spraying coffee across his bare feet as he stared in disbelief at the woman standing at the edge of his pool. She wasn't just standing there, she was methodically emptying the contents of what appeared to be large bags of playground sand directly into his meticulously maintained swimming pool. The woman, blonde bob cut with highlights that scream, "I need to speak to your manager," didn't even flinch at his outburst. She simply continued pouring, her movements deliberate and unhurried, as if she were adding sugar to her morning tea rather than destroying someone else's property. "Excuse me," David shouted, nearly tripping over his deck chair as he rushed down the steps toward the pool area. "What do you think you're doing to my pool?" The woman finally acknowledged his presence with a dismissive glance over her shoulder. Her oversized sunglasses caught the morning light as she straightened her back and put a hand on her hip. Fixing a neighborhood hazard, she replied coolly as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I'm Karen Westfield, HOA Vice President." She said this with the gravity someone might use to announce they were the Secretary of Defense. David's mouth fell open. "Hazard? It's a swimming pool, and you're pouring sand into it." Karen sighed as if dealing with a particularly slow child. "This pool is not up to code. The neighborhood bylaws clearly state, I don't care what the bylaws state. You can't just come onto my property and..." Article 7, Section 3.2, Karen continued, raising her voice over his protests. "All water features must be properly secured when the homeowner is not present, which yours wasn't last night when I conducted my inspection." David's blood pressure skyrocketed. "Inspection? You were trespassing on my property last night, and your solution is to destroy my pool with sand." "It's not destruction, Mr. Mitchell." She pronounced his name with exaggerated precision. "It's remediation. The Community Safety Board, which I chair, voted unanimously that unsecured pools should be converted to sandboxes until proper security measures are implemented." David ran his hands through his bedhead hair in disbelief. "There's no such thing as the Community Safety Board, and my pool has a locked gate and a cover." Karen sniffed disapprovingly. The lock was substandard and the cover wasn't properly secured. "I have photos." She patted her designer handbag. "Besides, a sandbox is much safer for the children." "What children? I don't have children." "The neighborhood children, Mr. Mitchell. This is a family community." David's next-door neighbor, Raj Patel, poked his head over the fence, likely drawn by the escalating voices. His eyes widened at the sight of sand floating on the pool's surface. "Dude," Raj breathed, "your pool." "I know." David gestured wildly. "She's insane." Karen's lips thinned to a dangerous line. "Insults will be noted in your HOA file, Mr. Mitchell." "I don't care about my HOA file. I want you off my property now before I call the police." Karen dropped the now empty bag and dusted her hands. "Go ahead. I have the bylaws and board approval on my side." She reached for her phone. "In fact, I'll gladly wait for them to arrive so I can explain how your negligence is endangering our community's children." David looked helplessly at his once beautiful pool, now cloudy with suspended sand, and then at the 5 more bags stacked neatly by the gate. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was suburban warfare. And Karen Westfield had just fired the first shot. By afternoon, David's backyard looked like a crime scene. Yellow police tape fluttered in the summer breeze around his pool area, not because of any actual crime, but because Officer Rodriguez had suggested it as a precaution after taking statements from both parties. The sand-clouded water now resembled a murky pond rather than the pristine oasis it had been just hours before. "So let me get this straight," said Raj, leaning against the fence with 2 cold beers in hand. He passed one to David, who accepted it gratefully. "The cops just left? After she dumped 50 pounds of sand in your pool?" David took a long swig before answering. "They said it's a civil matter. Apparently, since she's actually on the HOA board and there's some vague language in the bylaws about remediation of unsafe features, they can't definitively say she wasn't within her rights." "That's insane," Raj muttered, shaking his head. "What are you going to do?" Before David could answer, his phone buzzed with an incoming email. He pulled it out, then groaned audibly. "What now?" Raj asked. "Highway violation notice," David said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "I'm being fined $750 for improper pool maintenance resulting in cloudy, unsanitary water conditions." Raj choked on his beer. "She destroys your pool, then fines you for it being destroyed? That's next-level evil." "That's not all," David continued, scrolling. "There's an emergency HOA meeting tomorrow night about the Mitchell property situation. He dropped his phone onto the patio table with a clatter. "They're going to make an example of me." "You need reinforcements," Raj declared, pulling out his own phone. "My cousin Priya is a real estate attorney. She deals with HO and nightmares all the time." "I can't afford a lawyer right now," David admitted. "I just sank everything into this house and the pool restoration. That's why I haven't installed the approved security system yet. I was saving up." Raj waved dismissively. "Don't worry about that now. Just talk to her. First consultation is free." Later that evening, after a surprisingly encouraging call with Priya, David was researching HOA laws when movement at his front window caught his attention. Peering through the blinds, he spotted Karen walking slowly past his house, phone in hand, apparently taking photos of his property. "Oh, hell no," David muttered, yanking open his front door. "Can I help you with something, Karen?" Karen didn't even flinch at being caught. "Just documenting the continued state of disrepair," she replied, zooming her camera in on a perfectly innocuous shrub. "Your hedges exceed the permitted height by approximately 3 inches. Are you serious right now?" David stepped onto his porch. "After what you did to my pool, you're worried about my shrubs." "Rules are rules, Mr. Mitchell." Karen's smile was tight and practiced. "If you're not prepared to maintain your property to community standards, perhaps Oakwood Estates isn't the right neighborhood for you." That's when it clicked for David. "You're trying to force me out." Karen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, satisfaction perhaps at being understood. "I'm simply enforcing the guidelines that maintain our property values and community standards." "Why me?" Dave asked, genuinely puzzled. "I've been nothing but courteous since I moved in." "Your rush pool renovation cut corners," she said sharply. "The previous owners maintained that pool properly for 15 years. Within 6 months of your purchase, the water quality has visibly declined, the equipment makes excessive noise during restricted hours, and you've been repeatedly observed using glass containers in the pool area." David was stunned. "You've been watching me? And the rushed renovation was fixing the damage from the tree that fell during the winter storm before I even bought the place." A sleek black BMW pulled into the driveway next door, and an elegant older woman emerged. David recognized her as Vivian Edwards, the retired judge who lived on the other side of his property. She had welcomed him to the neighborhood with a homemade pie and gardening tips, but had otherwise kept to herself. "Everything all right over here?" Vivian called, approaching with a measured step. Her shrewd eyes took in the scene before her. "Just addressing some community standards issues," Karen replied smoothly. "Is that what we're calling criminal trespass and destruction of property these days?" Vivian asked mildly. She turned to David. "Your landscaper mentioned the pool incident when he was trimming my hedges this morning. I took the liberty of reviewing our HOA bylaws." She held up a well-worn binder. Fascinating reading. Karen's smile didn't waver, but her spine stiffened. As the former president of the HOA for 8 years before my judicial appointment, Vivian interrupted gently, and as someone who helped write those bylaws, I'm quite familiar with what they do and don't permit. She turned to David. "I understand there's an emergency meeting tomorrow night?" David nodded. "Excellent," Vivian said with a smile that somehow reminded David of a shark. "I believe I'll attend. It's been too long since I participated in community governance." For the first time since David had met her, Karen Westfield looked uncertain. She cleared her throat. "Well, I've completed my documentation. Good evening to you both." They watched in silence as Karen retreated down the street, her strides slightly less confident than before. "Thank you," David said finally. Vivian's expression softened. Karen Westfield has been terrorizing this neighborhood since she moved in 3 years ago. Her husband is on the city council, which has made her feel untouchable. She patted David's arm. But even Karen should know better than to pick a fight with a retired judge with too much time on her hands. As Vivian walked back to her house, David felt the first glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't fighting this battle alone. The Oakwood Estates Community Center was packed to capacity. David had arrived 20 minutes early on Vivian's advice, but still barely managed to find a seat in the back row. He recognized maybe a third of the faces, neighbors who had waved politely from their driveways or exchanged pleasantries at the mailboxes. The rest were strangers, yet all seemed keenly interested in what Raj had dubbed the Great Pool Sabotage. "Word travels fast in suburbia," Raj whispered, squeezing in beside him. "My mom's bridge club hasn't discussed anything else for 2 days." At the front of the room, a long table faced the audience. Karen sat at one end, immaculately dressed in a navy blazer with gold buttons, shuffling papers with practiced efficiency. Beside her sat a balding man with a permanent frown whom David recognized as Walter Simmons, the HOA president, and 3 other board members whose names David couldn't recall. The empty seat at the opposite end from Karen remained conspicuously vacant until precisely 7:00 p.m., when Vivian Edwards made her entrance. The room fell silent as she glided down the center aisle, nodded politely to the board, and took her seat. She placed a leather portfolio and the HOA bylaws binder on the table before her. "Is she on the board?" David whispered to Raj. "Not anymore, but apparently once you've been president, you retain certain privileges," Raj replied. "My mom says Vivian built this place from nothing after her husband died. The development is basically her legacy." Walter Simmons cleared his throat nervously. "Let's call this emergency meeting of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association to order. We're here to discuss recent events involving the property at 42 Sycamore Lane." Karen immediately raised her hand. "If I may begin with a presentation on the safety violations." "Point of order," Vivian interrupted smoothly. "Before we discuss specific allegations, I believe the homeowner deserves an opportunity to address the board." Walter looked between the two women like a referee uncertain which boxer might throw the first punch. "Yes, of course. Mr. Mitchell, would you like to make a statement?" David stood, acutely aware of all eyes on him. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but now, facing this roomful of neighbors and the woman who had ruined his pool, he felt his prepared remarks inadequate. "My name is David Mitchell," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "6 months ago, I bought my dream home in what I thought was a friendly community. 2 days ago, I woke up to find the HOA vice president trespassing on my property and deliberately pouring sand into my swimming pool." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Ms. Westfield claims this was done to address safety concerns, but at no point did anyone from the HOA formally notify me of violations or give me an opportunity to address them. Instead, Ms. Westfield took it upon herself to damage my property, then issued me a $750 fine for the resulting condition of my pool. Karen's face remained impassive, but her knuckles whitened around her pen. "I've since learned that Ms. Westfield has a history of targeting certain homeowners with selective enforcement, while ignoring similar issues at other properties." David gestured to a folder Raj passed him. "I have documentation showing at least 7 properties with unsecured water features identical to mine, none of which have been remediated with sand." David passed the folder to Walter. "I've also discovered that Ms. Westfield's husband's construction company has been awarded every contract for HOA-mandated remediation work in the past 3 years, including the contract to install the specific pool security system she insists I need." This revelation caused a much louder reaction, with several homeowners turning to speak animatedly to their neighbors. "Furthermore," David continued, gaining confidence, "I've filed a police report for trespassing and property damage. While they consider it primarily a civil matter, they did confirm that nothing in the HOA bylaws authorizes any board member to enter private property without permission or to damage personal property under the guise of remediation." Karen finally spoke up. "This is absurd. As HOA vice president, I have every right to." "You have the right to document violations from public spaces and issue notices," Vivian cut in. "You do not have the right to enter private property or take remediation into your own hands. Section 5, paragraph 3 of the very bylaws you claim to enforce makes that explicitly clear." Walter Simmons looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Perhaps we should." The community center door swung open, interrupting him. A tall man in an expensive suit strode in, followed by a younger woman carrying a leather briefcase. David recognized the woman as Raz's cousin Priya, but the man was a stranger. "Councilman Westfield," Walter acknowledged nervously. "This is a closed HOA meeting." "My wife called me," the man replied smoothly, fixing his gaze on David. "She mentioned some accusations were being made." "James," Karen said, relief evident in her voice. "This homeowner is threatening legal action over standard HOA enforcement." Before David could respond, Priya stepped forward, Priya Patel representing Mr. Mitchell. She nodded to Councilman Westfield with professional courtesy. "Councilman, I'm glad you're here. It saves us having to schedule a separate meeting regarding the potential conflict of interest in your wife's enforcement actions and your company's contracts with this HOA." The room fell so silent David could hear the air conditioning hum. "I've reviewed the HOA financial records," Priya continued, "which are public under state law. In the past 3 years, Westfield Construction has received over $300,000 in contracts from this HOA, all without competitive bidding, many following enforcement actions initiated by Mrs. Westfield." An elderly woman in the front row stood up shakily. "Is that why I had to pay $4,000 to replace my fence last year? Because it wasn't up to code." "And why I had to redo my entire driveway?" called another voice. Floodgates opened. Suddenly, homeowners throughout the room were standing, sharing stories of Karen's aggressive enforcement and the costly approved vendors they had been required to use, vendors that, as it turned out, were frequently connected to Westfield Construction. Councilman Westfield's confident expression faltered. He glanced at his wife, whose face had gone from porcelain to granite. "These are serious allegations," Walter Simmons said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "Perhaps we should adjourn to discuss." "Motion to vote," called a voice from the back. I move that we suspend Karen Westfield from the HOA board pending an investigation. I second, called another voice immediately. Walter looked helplessly at the crowd, then at Karen and her husband, and finally at Vivian, who sat calmly observing the chaos. All in favor? Walter asked weakly, raising his own hand as dozens of arms shot up around the room. Opposed. Only Karen, her husband, and one other board member raised their hands. Motion carries, Walter announced, bringing down his gavel with surprising firmness. Karen Westfield is suspended from the HOA board effective immediately. Furthermore, I move that we establish an independent committee to review all enforcement actions and vendor contracts from the past 3 years. As the meeting dissolved into excited chatter, David felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Vivian standing behind him, a satisfied smile on her face. "Well played," she said, "but this is just the beginning. Karen won't go down without a fight." David looked across the room where Karen was engaged in a heated whispered argument with her husband. "What happens now?" "Now," Vivian said, "we clean up your pool, and then we clean up this HOA." For the first time since finding sand in his pool, David felt himself smile. The battle wasn't over, but at least now he had an army at his back. 3 weeks after the explosive HOA meeting, David's backyard was once again a hub of activity, but this time with a decidedly different atmosphere. Where once there had been yellow police tape and murky water, now there was laughter, the sizzle of grilling burgers, and the crystal-clear blue of a newly restored pool. To David, McGrage announced, raising his beer in a toast, the man who took on the Wicked Witch of Westfield and lived to tell the tale. A chorus of cheers rose from the dozen or so neighbors gathered around David's pool deck for what he had called his reclamation celebration. Vivian Edwards clinked her wine glass against David's beer bottle, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "The battle, my dear, not the war," she corrected. "Though I must say the first skirmish went rather well." "Better than well," Priya added, stepping onto the deck with a folder tucked under her arm. As usual, she looked impeccably professional despite the casual backyard gathering. "I just got word that the county prosecutor is opening an investigation into the HOA's contracting practices. Apparently, Councilman Westfield should have been more careful about which zoning ordinances he was willing to overlook in exchange for construction contracts." David whistled. That escalated quickly. "Once you pull on a loose thread," Vivian shrugged elegantly. "Speaking of threads," Raj interjected, "did you all see that the Westfield's house went on the market yesterday? Walter says the listing agent told him they're relocating for career opportunities." David nearly choked on his beer. "They're leaving? Rats fleeing a sinking ship," Vivian murmured. "James Westfield's political aspirations won't survive a corruption scandal." David looked around at his backyard, at his neighbors laughing and talking, at the children splashing in his pool under the watchful eye of their parents, at the sense of community that had sprung up from the ruins of Karen's vindictiveness, and felt an unexpected twinge of, was it pity? "Don't you dare," Priya said, correctly reading his expression. "That woman cost you nearly $5,000 in pool repairs, not to mention the stress and the violation of your property rights." "I know," David sighed. "It's just, I never wanted anyone to have to leave their home." "They're not leaving because of you," Vivian reminded him gently. "They're leaving because their own actions caught up with them. There's a difference." Before David could respond, Walter Simmons approached their group looking nervous as usual, but with a certain newfound dignity. As the only remaining senior board member after 2 others had resigned in the wake of the scandal, he had stepped up impressively. "David," Walter greeted him, extending his hand. "Wonderful party. I wanted to let you know personally that the board has unanimously voted to reimburse you for all pool restoration costs, plus the legal fees." David's jaw dropped. "What? But the investigation isn't even complete." Walter smiled thinly. "Let's just say that once we started looking into the books, certain board members became very eager to make restitution rather than face further scrutiny." "That's wow. Thank you." "No, thank you," Walter said with surprising firmness. "What the Westfields were doing, what we allowed them to do through our negligence, was wrong. You stood up when most of us were too afraid to rock the boat." After Walter moved on to mingle with other guests, Raj nudged David's arm. "Look at you, neighborhood hero. Not bad for the new guy." "Hardly a hero," David protested. "I just wanted my pool back." "And yet," Vivian observed, "you accomplished so much more. The review committee has already identified 23 households that were unfairly fined or forced into unnecessary renovations. The new bylaws amendments will prevent any future board member from having that kind of unchecked power. Plus," Raj added with a grin, "you've got the best pool party reputation in Oakwood Estates now. Social currency, my friend, very valuable." David laughed and was about to respond when a hush fell over the gathering. He turned to see what had caught everyone's attention and found Karen Westfield standing at the gate to his backyard. Gone was the impeccably styled HOA tyrant of 3 weeks ago. The Karen who stood before them now wore no makeup. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and instead of her usual designer outfits, she wore jeans and a plain blouse. As David approached the gate, the party guests parted like the Red Sea, conversations dying as everyone strained to hear what was about to transpire. "Karen," David greeted her cautiously. "This is unexpected." Karen's eyes darted around the yard, taking in the restored pool, the gathered neighbors, the unmistakable atmosphere of celebration. Her gaze finally settled on David. Her voice faltered and she cleared her throat. "I came to apologize." The collective intake of breath from the onlookers was audible. "James and I are moving to Phoenix," she continued when David remained silent. "His sister has a construction company there that's offered him a partnership." "I heard," David said neutrally. "Congratulations." Karen's lips pressed together, and for a moment he glimpsed the old Karen, proud, defensive, ready to strike. But then something in her seemed to deflate. "I was wrong," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "About your pool, about how I treated you, about a lot of things. James says we need a fresh start where people don't know us, and he's probably right." David studied her face, searching for signs of the calculating woman who had dumped sand in his pool with such cold determination. Instead, he saw something he hadn't expected: vulnerability. "Would you like to come in?" he offered, surprising himself as much as everyone listening. "There's plenty of food." Karen looked stunned. "You're inviting me to your pool party? After what I did?" David shrugged. "Everyone deserves a second chance. Besides, it's sort of a community healing event. Might as well include everyone." For a moment, it seemed like Karen might accept. Then her gaze drifted over his shoulder to where Vivian stood watching, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "I appreciate the offer," Karen said finally, "but I should go. We have a lot of packing to do." She hesitated, then added, "Your pool looks nice. Better than before." With that awkward compliment, she turned and walked away, shoulders straight but not quite achieving the imperial posture she had once maintained. As David returned to his guests, Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Very magnanimous of you." "Maybe," David conceded, "or maybe I just wanted to see her face when she realized she couldn't hurt me anymore." A slow smile spread across Vivian's face. "David Mitchell, I do believe there's more to you than meets the eye." She clinked her glass against his once more. "To new beginnings and pools without sand." As the laughter and conversation resumed around him, David looked out at his backyard paradise, not just restored but improved by the community that had rallied around him. Karen had meant to isolate him, to drive him away. Instead, she had inadvertently given him exactly what he had hoped to find when he moved to Oakwood Estates: a place to belong. 1 year later, David stood at his kitchen window, cup of coffee in hand, admiring the morning light dancing across his pool. The anniversary of what Oakwood Estates residents now jokingly referred to as the sand incident had arrived, and with it came an opportunity for reflection. The neighborhood had changed dramatically in 12 months. After the Westfield's departure, the power vacuum in the HOA had initially created chaos. But from that chaos had emerged something remarkable. Walter Simmons, once Karen's nervous puppet, had evolved into a thoughtful, measured HOA president who consulted with residents rather than dictating to them. The new bylaws, drafted with Vivian's guidance and Praya's legal expertise, had transformed Oakwood Estates from a battleground of petty tyranny into a model of community governance. David's phone chimed with a text from Raj. "Ready for the big day?" He smiled. Today wasn't just the anniversary of Karen's sand attack. It was also the grand opening of the Oakwood Estates Community Center renovation, a project he now headed as the newest member of the HOA board. When Walter had first approached him about running for the board, David had laughed outright. "You want the guy who merely brought down the entire HOA to help run it?" "No," Walter had replied with unexpected wisdom. "I want the guy who cared enough to fix it." A sound of a car door closing drew David's attention back to the present. Through the window, he spotted Vivian walking briskly up his driveway, elegant as always despite the early hour. "Good morning," she called when he opened the door. "I brought the final inspection report for the community center." She handed him a folder. "All approved. We're clear for the opening ceremony at noon." "Perfect," David said, ushering her in. "Coffee." "Please. I've been up since 5 finalizing the historical display." The historical display had been Vivian's pet project, a permanent exhibition in the community center documenting the neighborhood's evolution from its founding through present day, including the recent reforms. She had insisted on including the sand incident as a turning point in the community's history, much to David's embarrassment. "You know," David said, pouring her coffee, "when I bought this house, all I wanted was a quiet place with a nice pool where I could keep to myself after my divorce. I never planned on becoming the catalyst for neighborhood revolution." Vivian's eyes twinkled. The best leaders rarely set out to lead. They simply stand up when standing is required. "Quoting yourself again?" he teased, familiar with her habit of dropping wisdom from her years on the bench. Touche, she laughed. Now, have you prepared your speech for today? David groaned. I still don't see why I have to speak. Can't Walter do it? Walter will introduce you, but the community wants to hear from the man who saved Oakwood Estates from the Sandbox tyrant. That's not what happened, and you know it, David protested. It was a team effort. Indeed it was, Vivian agreed, which is precisely the point of your speech, how individual action sparked collective change. Several hours later, David stood behind a podium on the freshly finished deck of the renovated community center. Before him stretched rows of chairs filled with neighbors. Some he now counted as close friends, others he knew only by name, but all united by shared investment in their community. The renovated center was stunning. The once shabby building now featured a modern library, meeting spaces, a fitness center, and through the wide windows behind him, the community pool sparkled in the sunlight, not a grain of sand in sight. Walter stepped up to the microphone first. 1 year ago, our community stood at a crossroads. Years of mismanagement and abuse of power had eroded the trust that should be the foundation of any neighborhood. It took one resident, a newcomer with the courage to stand up, to show us what we had lost and how to reclaim it. As Walter introduced him, David's gaze drifted over the crowd. His eyes caught on an unexpected face in the back row. Though partially hidden by sunglasses and with hair now cut in a stylish bob, there was no mistaking Karen Westfield. David felt a moment of panic as he took the podium, but when their eyes met, Karen gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She hadn't come to cause trouble. She had come to witness what had grown from the seeds of conflict she had unwittingly planted. Collecting himself, David began his speech. A year ago, I woke up to find sand in my pool. A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. I was angry, confused, and felt completely alone in a neighborhood where I'd hoped to find a fresh start. He paused, looking out at the faces turned toward him, faces that had become familiar over potluck dinners, community cleanup days, and committee meetings. What I discovered instead was something far more valuable than an uncontaminated pool. I found that one person standing up can inspire others to do the same. I found that communities aren't built by rigid rules and harsh enforcement, but by shared purpose and mutual respect. As David continued his speech, he noticed Karen quietly rise from her seat and slip toward the exit. He didn't draw attention to her presence. Some chapters were better left closed. But he couldn't help wondering if somewhere in Phoenix, she had perhaps learned something from her Oakwood Estates experience. The true measure of a community, David concluded, isn't how it behaves when everything is perfect. It's how it responds when things go wrong. A year ago, sand in a pool revealed cracks in our foundation. Today, we celebrate not just a renovated building, but a renovated community, stronger, more inclusive, and more resilient than before. The applause was immediate and heartfelt. As David stepped away from the podium, Raj clapped him on the shoulder. Not bad for a guy who just wanted a swimming pool, he teased. You know what the irony is? David said as they moved toward the ribbon-cutting ceremony. I use the pool less now than I did before. I'm too busy with all these community projects. Suffering from success, Raj laughed. Later, as the celebration continued around him, David found a quiet moment to slip away to the parking lot. Karen was just getting into her car when he approached. I wasn't sure you'd come back to Oakwood Estates, he said simply. Karen studied him for a moment before responding. I'm just passing through, finalizing the sale of our house. She hesitated. James and I divorced. Turns out corruption charges aren't great for a marriage. I'm sorry to hear that, David said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Don't be, she replied with unexpected candor. It was long overdue. She gestured toward the community center. You've done good work here. The place looks happy. It is, David acknowledged. You should see the new bylaws. No more sand remediation permitted. A ghost of a smile crossed Karen's face. I deserve that. She opened her car door. For what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just for your pool, but for everything. David nodded, accepting the apology for what it was, imperfect, like all human gestures, but sincere. Safe travels, Karen. As she drove away, David turned back toward the sound of laughter and conversation flowing from the community center. Through the large windows, he could see his neighbors. Vivian holding court with a group of senior residents, Walter proudly showing off the new library, children splashing in the pool under the watchful eyes of their parents. A year ago, Sandbox had threatened to bury his dreams of a peaceful home. Instead, it had become the foundation for something he had known he was looking for, not just a house with a pool, but a true community where he belonged. David smiled and walked back toward the celebration, leaving footprints in the sand of a new chapter. The end.